Well, welcome everybody. Very nice to see everybody. I'm glad that the title sounded interesting. I hope that the entire presentation will prove interesting. I am Rosanne Welch. I teach at a couple places actually, because that's how you do it these days. Stevens College is actually in Missouri, but we run an MFA in screenwriting here in Los Angeles, well here, north of here in Los Angeles. And so that's my specialty. I was a television writer for about 20 years, and then I got into academia. So I studied history because I wasn't sure I wanted to study writing. So I ended up doing a lot of history stuff, which was fascinating. And so today we're going to look at this show that we all love, which started out to teach history, and how much of it, you know, is real and how much is fake. And these are kind of the breadth of the place that I want to cover. I come from, as I said, TV writing, so I was on all these shows in the past. And even on a show like Touched by an Angel, we would deal with history, because angels, of course, last forever. It was a traveling angel show where the angels happened to be angels. But right, stylistically, The Fugitive is a traveling angel show, MacGyver is a traveling angel show. Doctor Who is a traveling angel show. Someone who just goes from place to place and helps other people out. And I think that's really, really cool. And then, like I said, I got a PhD at Claremont University, also in slightly above us, a couple hours. And that's where I focused on history for a while before I went back into working and writing. So that's where I'm sort of interested in both of these areas. And I think we see that show up in Doctor Who. I'm also on the editorial board for these various journals, so very interested in how writing is presented to people and how stories are told. I was extremely lucky. The magazine of the Writers Guild, written by Magazine, I was on the board for that, like I said, and the editor knew that I was a huge Doctor Who fan. So in that period when Russell came to town and did that 4th season of Torchwood here in town, he called me, the editor called me and said, "We're going to interview him. Would you like to be the one to talk to him?" To which I said, yeah, can I do that right away? And it was great because, as most of these things go, the PR person set me up in a room with Russell, and it was this glass room in the middle of this fancy place in Santa Monica. And the guy said, "Well, you have 20 minutes. And I was like, "I can do this in 20 minutes, right? I'm happy to be here." And 20 minutes passed, and you saw the PR guy open the door and poke in, and Russell was like, "I'm not done yet." And he kicked the PR guy out because I knew what I was talking about, and I was asking him these really interesting questions, and he was having such a great time. We ended up talking for an hour, and you just saw the man walk around looking, but he didn't want to poke his head in again and get yelled at. So it was a marvelous and fun time, and this interview is online on this particular website, which is on the Writers Guild website. And I've also written a bunch of books, not all about Doctor Who. These 3 happen to be about Doctor Who, and just got me very interested in analyzing the show. And why has it been so popular for so long? We know it's provided us a really interesting character, who obviously there are many versions of, and we're all very happy to see all those different versions. But why else, right? Why else does it stick with us? The latest book is the one that's right up here, and it's about Jodie's era. Hello. Because that was, of course, a very iconic moment in all television, right? But what we're talking about today is the real history behind Doctor Who. We know from the beginning the show was meant to teach history. It was a children's program. And I think that's a really lovely idea. And so they began with 2 teachers as companions. That was so intentional, and it worked. It was a great way to warm people up, and you had to have people who knew something about where they were going, who had something to say. And of course, we had a student. You have to have someone you can talk to, right? So it was a really lovely blend of characters. One of the earliest ones they did went into the world of the Romans. Everyone's always fascinated by the Romans. And I think what's really interesting is, sadly, just a little bit later, Highlanders was the last historical one they produced in that early period. They decided it wasn't what the audience wanted. What did the audience want?
Gimmicks and products?
Daleks, right? The Daleks showed up, and that was it. They were like, "Oh, no, this is what the audience is coming for. Forget that history, forget that study, don't learn anything. It's okay." Also, we know that once we get to John Pertwee and he's trapped on Earth, he can't travel. So there's no way he's going to go into the past. So we lose a chunk of time where there was this moment to do something about history. And then New Who showed up, and we gained it back. And so even though we did touch on the Romans in the Hartnell area, this is the Roman period that we remember from Doctor Who, right? Everyone's always been interested in the world, the real world of Pompeii, and what would have happened that day. It's marvelous when he and Donna land, and it's volcano day. but they don't even know what it is. They don't understand what might happen to them. And that's such an interesting mindset for an audience to come into. What is the story when you don't know the ending? When the real people who lived through it, that is so fascinating to us. As humans, what we want to know is, how would I have behaved in that situation, right? So what I think really works about this, we have to think about it, we're in 79 AD. I did this chronologically, even though I'm not chronological by doctors, I'm chronological by years. We're in this giant period in the Roman era. And what's happening here is, looking at this map, Herculaneum is something we want to pay attention to, and Miserium, because we're going to bring ourselves over here to Pompeii, and we're going to talk in a minute about the boats that came trying to save people, because they had no idea what kind of time they had going on, right? So what I think is really interesting is, who are the famous people involved in Pompeii? And gee whiz, at a certain point, Emperor Nero had come to Pompeii and played at the arena. That was a thing, right, that emperors would do. They would travel through the area. But you'll notice I have some photographs here. There's the actual place that he played, the arena. There's the bust of the emperor. So a real person really existed, right, really. And then what's over here on the right side? I, Claudius. And there's something very particular about that picture from I, Claudius. Somehow, we have friends who start in I, Claudius and end up in the world of Doctor Who. I think that's so charming to think about how their acting careers have spread all this time, right, and brought them eventually to Doctor Who. And I love Derek Jacobi. He's quite so wonderful. But yeah, so Emperor Nero was someone who had been to Pompeii, was not there on Volcano Day, right, but knew the place. It was a real place people went to. The other inside Who history is we know who was a guest star on that particular episode. I think Doctor Who does a lovely job of, if they find an actor they like, they find a way to reuse them and just talk our way out of how they were once part of something. And of course, he also appeared in Torchwood, which I think is a brilliant piece.
Colin Baker was a guard.
Yes.
He was a doctor.
Isn't that amazing? I know. I just, and the Martha Jones. That's Colin Baker, exactly. And Martha's cousin died earlier, and then she showed up. Yeah, exactly. So I think it's fun. But in the real world, there was this famous guy named Pliny the Elder. And he was a writer, and he was a military man, and he was the guy in Miserium on the day this was happening. And he commanded a bunch of ships. So almost in the way that we know modern history and Dunkirk and the idea of going across and getting as many people back, he did that. Well, he tried to do that, let's say that, sadly. He commanded all his ships to head toward Pompeii. He had a friend who lived there. Of course, he wanted to save as many people as possible. But his friend had a magnificent library. And his thought was, we can't lose this library. And there was the earthquake happening. They knew something was wrong. They did not know this giant lava flow would happen. But he sent a bunch of boats over that way, and he rowed one of them himself, right, as commander. They landed before the lava flow. Everything was so rocky and messy, they couldn't take off again. They'd made the mistake of bringing themselves to a place they couldn't leave, right? So he did spend the night at his friend's house thinking, okay, we'll figure it out in the morning, it'll be fine. And then when everything started to happen, he couldn't leave and ended up in the rush trying to get back to the shore and see if it was possible. He had a heart attack and died. And we know this because his younger son was across the way watching from a boat that hadn't landed and trying to see if something was possible, and it just wasn't possible. This is just a beautiful look at the mountain, which just looks really pretty until what happens. But this was so pivotal in history that artists have done paintings of it over the years. Everyone's been trying to, we want to understand that day and how did it feel. Now, most people have probably seen the photographs of what happened to the people that day, and that we have the forms. I didn't choose to show one of those photographs. We've seen them before. But the idea that people were frozen in place because they simply couldn't leave. But it also is why we learn so much about their real world. Because when people write their history, they clean it up. Right? They don't tell us all the real things that might be going on. But because this happened in a moment and nobody had time to, we know about the brothels. We know about the real world of Pompeii, which means it was the real world of many Roman towns at that time. And so that's why people have been fascinated for so long. What I like about this picture is that look how well they kind of gave us the same color feeling in that moment visually in the show. So Pompei, I think, is done really well, right? There's no way they can save anybody, but they do save the one fictional family because we have to do something thematically that makes Donna there on purpose. And that's a whole screenwriting thing. How do you write about a piece of history and you can't change it, but you have to have as happy an ending as you can get? That's a real challenge for a writer. Now, what I love about Robot of Sherwood is that we know Robin Hood didn't really exist, and yet they wanted to play with him. And so over time, there's been this whole big thought about, well, was he or wasn't he? And so the best we can trace is he's first mentioned in the 14th century in this one story. And that's it. Like, oh, wait a minute. Did this guy exist or did he not? And he was poor in the original story. He was not a rich man who, stole from the rich to give to the poor. He was a poor guy who got in trouble for being a thief. That's the very beginning. You move into the 15th century in the Jest of Robin Hood, and here the line exists, if he is poor, he will have some of mine. So now we have the rich guy giving to the poor. So we're building on the myth through time. So he's truly this legendary literary character that has almost become real to us. Right? His time period is real, King Richard is real, the Crusades are real, but they all start conflagrating things together as literature grows. Right? So we can't say Maid Marian really existed. We can't say any of that. But he appears in the 1800s in Ivanhoe. Right? And that solidifies this character to the point where when we get into the world of film starting in the early 1900s, Robin Hood is a natural character for people who want to play. And of course, you've seen the iconic Errol Flynn and all that sort of thing. We move all the way up through. We get to the modern day. So I think it's really cool that they covered him. It's true that there is a Sherwood Forest that you can go to. It's a real place. This is called Major Oak, and it has been around for all these many years. So if there were men of Sherwood Forest, this is where they hung out. So it is a very popular place for people. What I do love about this episode is that they deal with the idea of when does one become a legend, and what is a legend, and what's the importance of stories. I think this is one of my most creative endings I think the show ever had, where the doctor admits he's not a hero, and we come to the end with, I'm just as real as you are. And who knows if 100 years from now, what if we lost all the ways to do television, right? What if we lost all this material and a way for someone to watch what we've made? Will they just hear the stories about this character and believe he might have been real? I think that's the fun of dealing with Robin Hood in Doctor Who. But back to actual history, Marco Polo really existed. Whether or not he knew kids play games in pools with his name is a whole different story. But did in fact really exist and was introduced to us in this period of Who where they thought they were mostly going to focus on history. You can see him in a more recent version in the Netflix show, which I think did a much more realistic job of dealing with the whole Mongol Empire and giving us a more true and human experience of who all of the folks were. This is some drawings from the period. Again, real people. Kublai Khan was a real man, a real emperor of a real giant place. This is the travels of Marco Polo, which I think are fascinating. We don't think about how much people could travel back in the day. That's not something that we think about. It's hard enough to get on a plane and get from here to Cleveland when I visit my relatives, right? It's a pain in the butt to transfer. Think about the traveling they did to go across land, across water, all the stuff they had to do. And yet, some people did this. They had these adventures. And in fact, you'll notice just a little word down there, but his travels created the Silk Road. And the Silk Road was this amazing trading station, if you will, all the way across. And something that we still reference today, right? We still think about trade between countries. I was just talking to my son the other day, who's 26 and out of college. And for some reason, we were talking about food in France, and there were less tomatoes in France, but more in Italy. And suddenly he was like, but they didn't always have tomatoes in Italy, did they? And I was like, no, they didn't. Not until after Columbus came from here to there and brought the tomatoes back. So this exchange has always been going on between cultures, and I think that's really fascinating. I've got Yo-Yo Ma down here in the bottom because he created a group called the Silk Road Ensemble, which is musicians from many places sharing their musical history. So just the, if you will, the influence of what Marco Polo did has existed all this time. And I think that's just, I mean, think about, I haven't traveled to any of these places in the modern world. And they were traveling then, which is quite amazing.
I've traveled to India.
Sorry.
You have? How wonderful. Oh, that's so exciting. Yeah, that is a place I would love to go. I've got a friend who's an academic there who just wrote a book on early women TV writers in India, which I'm fascinated by. We're always into that. Oh, that's so cool. Well, there you go. Then you traveled a bit in the footsteps of Marco Polo. He wrote a book about his travels, so real man, giving a real history to the world. And I think it's beautiful. He said on his deathbed, I haven't told half of what I saw. They were too amazing and too much for people. So a real person we met in Doctor Who, right? What the idea was, the hopes was that children would see these names and these moments in history. And then, of course, they would go to their library and ask for a book about it and get more details. And that's really what a lot of course, writers are hoping, that they're turning people on to things they should know more about. I've always laughed because when I was a kid and I watched The Sound of Music, I got really worried, because at the end it's their manager on the stage and they've all left. You're like, oh no, what happened to him? And I tried to look him up in encyclopedias, because that was before there was Google. And I couldn't find him, and I finally read the book written by Maria von Trapp. Well, he never existed. Their friend who was a priest was the person who booked them into the places they sang, and then they took care of it themselves. He was an invention in the movie. So I couldn't find anything more about him. But I was able to read about the rest of the family and the real story. So that one moment of spark, that interest, is what a writer hopes. You're going to then go find out the rest of the story. So in that case, there's actually a book one could read about Marco Polo's travels. Also in the Heart Null, because we're in the we're going to do history area, we do the Aztec episode, which is really quite fun. And we've learned a lot more, and we've learned to relook at what we teach about the Aztecs and all the empires of Latin America before the Spanish conquistadors came. But when we think about the giantness of this empire, it's amazing, right, that one person was controlling this whole area with his military. They were brilliant in their science. They were brilliant in their farming. If you're going to have that many people, how are you going to feed them? It's all about the food and the water and how you use it. So the fact that they created these ways to dam up water underneath the reserves, that's really kind of cool. We're talking today about using our climate better. They were already doing it, right? They didn't have to be talked into it. Their architecture was incredible. We often think about the architecture of many of the early civilizations, whether it's the Egyptians, whether we're going to Chichen Itza or places like that. And I don't know if you are into UFO theories, but there's a lot of theories that the UFOs had to help people build these things. Academics look at that and say, we're not saying that about the Romans. We're letting it be that the Romans built their own stuff. We're picking on all the people who aren't white. They needed help, right? No, they didn't. They did that stuff on their own. It might have taken a few generations, but it's not like they had TV to watch, right? They were working on these projects, and a father would train his son, It was an honor to work on these projects. So it's amazing to think what the human body can do if you just focus and give it. Who's it? Malcolm Gladwell said it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert at something. These guys had 10,000 hours to go, and they passed it on and passed it on. So it was an amazing empire that did amazing things. This is a really cool ball game they had. See if you could play that, right? You could use your elbow and your head, and you had to get the ball up into that hole. That's not a down basketball hoop like, gravity's going to help you. There's no gravity. That's all about your angles. Right? It's fascinating. And that was one of their time-passing things. But of course, the entire empire disappears to us when the Spanish conquistadors show up. When I was a kid, they would teach us that these guys were the heroes of the story, because in their part of the world they were. But obviously now we've come to realize the destruction of these various empires that had done quite well without them coming along. So yes, it was really the end. We don't know always, was it just the disease that was brought? In the same way that happened to indigenous Americans? Was it obviously also some military conquering? All of that led to the fall of the empire. Somebody asked me once in class, and I had never thought of this, isn't it odd and amazing that the indigenous people couldn't take the diseases that came from Europe, but the Europeans didn't get anything from the indigenous people that hurt them? So what was going on that they lived in a way that they weren't creating infections that could then travel to a different culture? And I don't think anyone has an answer for that.
The theory I heard was that the Eurasian landmass was so large that there was cross-fertilization of disease, which made the Europeans more resistant.
Ah, that's brilliant. See, thank you.
Not mine.
No. But that's what we love, right? That's what participation is all about, because that's how we share our knowledge. That's kind of all what we're doing here, right? Thank you. Yeah, so Aztecs, really existing people. Chronologically, if we're thinking about Doctor Who, we move over to Shakespeare, who's almost legendary, but also actually did exist. And I do love this episode as well, because we look at that period, and we, the actor versus the real Shakespeare. Yeah, we don't have any pictures, obviously, no cameras yet, but we have drawings, we have ideas about him. Particularly, we have the breadth of plays. Although what we in the English world think, in terms of English teachers' world, think about, could he be the guy who really wrote them, right? There's a whole level of study that goes, wait a minute, maybe it wasn't him at all. We have no record of him traveling, so how did he know what Italy was like and Verona? How could he write about these places so realistically? Was there someone else who was doing the writing and using this actor as their front? Right, and it goes all the way down to whether or not it was the Queen who actually liked to write but couldn't possibly do such a thing. So it's one of those lovely sort of mysteries of literature that goes on and on. But obviously we have this breadth of beautiful stuff. We also have to remember that he is using stories he's heard that were never written down. So while they're Shakespeare to us, who's to say what he learned them from? In the same way when we think about some early stuff on television, right? Those guys were copying stuff they'd seen in vaudeville that had never been recorded. So we don't even know who to thank for the conveyor belt deal on Lucy, right? Because she probably saw somebody else do something similar on stage. But that wasn't something, again, we have a privilege to things that we have copies of, whether it's written or whether it's visual once we have that. But of course, we have connections too as well, because being an English actor, you got to do some Shakespeare in your career. So as we know, David went off and did that. He also, with Catherine Tate, did Much Ado About Nothing. So if you haven't seen any of these, always fun to see Shakespeare with an actor that you like. It really helps the piece come more believable to you. It's difficult when I used to teach high school, difficult to get kids into Shakespeare. But if they saw actors they knew, it made it a little easier. Although I will admit that my favorite Much Ado is actually the Emma Thompson one. So if you haven't seen that one, I think that's quite a lovely one. David and Catherine are great. So we have this Shakespeare connection. I couldn't believe it took them this long to get to a Mary Shelley episode. We had to wait until we had a female doctor to go see the female woman who invented science fiction. Kind of amazing that for all these years it had never occurred to them that we should meet Mary Shelley on the night that she invents Frankenstein. So I do love this episode. Of course, the real Mary Shelley. There in the British Museum, they have her original pieces with notes and whatnot. And Percy did give her notes, but what was really fascinating, of course, there was a whole, oh, well, she couldn't have written that. It must be the boy wrote it, and then he pretended she did it. Yeah, I know. But by the notes, we can see his handwriting versus hers, and then we can see the various iterations until the published version came out, and you can see how many of his notes she took and how many she threw away, which is the nature of rewriting. You get all your friends to give you some thoughts, and then it's your choice because you're the writer, right? So I think that's pretty cool. What's some? Yeah, the UFOs. Yeah, see what I'm saying? Now, what some people don't know is that when the book was first published in 1808, there's no author's name on it. Because women weren't allowed to write novels, they weren't allowed to read novels. If they read novels, it would shrivel up their inner organs and they couldn't have children. It was bad for their brain, it was too taxing. So you wouldn't allow women to read novels. Oh, terrible. Exactly, there you go, right? I mean, that's why women couldn't vote. It was too taxing for their uterus, right? But when it became so incredibly popular and she herself was famous, the next versions then came out with her name on them. And that's when the whole, what, did she really do it or did the boy do it, went on and on forever. Very sad though, and if you read Frankenstein, really a fascinating thing to do again with students, it is really the story of a bad parent. And what happens if you don't nurture the child you create. I mean, that's really the story of Frankenstein. And here's a woman who had had a miscarriage, right? Didn't have the chance to be the parent that she wanted, and more so was the child of a woman who had died when she was born. so she didn't have the experience of knowing her mother, even though her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, had written one of the first books on feminism to exist in the English world, right, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. She actually thinks voting is a good idea. What a crazy thought. So it's really kind of amazing to think that that's the genesis of Frankenstein, is this essay about parenting and how important that role is in the world. But also cool that a woman invented science fiction. So, yes. Now, they love authors on Doctor Who. You know why? Because they're all writers. Writers love authors. Writers like to think about the lives of other writers. So we had this lovely moment in the early Eccleston era, in his year, where we met Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens, of course, being a fascinating real guy. Tons of books. Again, some that we've heard of, some we haven't had time to read, many that were made into films, again, in the early days. There's a great quote about how in the early 30s and 40s, the people who ran the studios, the moguls, were men without education, but they wanted to appear intelligent and classy. So they hired people who could tell them what should we make movies out of. And they made Ivanhoe, and they made A Tale of Two Cities. And then we got to an era of dudes who graduated from Harvard who liked comic books. And what do we watch in the movies today? How many Avengers can you possibly watch? So it's interesting. But of course, just a slew of things behind his name. More Who history. We have an appearance, right? And then suddenly Eve Miles becomes Gwen Cooper. And there's a moment where they discuss, haven't we seen you before? Oh, yes, I had a great aunt who once lived, and et cetera, et cetera. So really kind of fun how that works. But Dickens, I also think, has a beautiful ending, because that's the question any writer has. Will the work I've done be of value after I'm gone? And so what a beautiful moment to have the doctor tell someone, your stuff will always be there. This message you put out in the world. I just think that's one of the most beautiful endings. Now, sadly.
It's like that Vincent moment.
Exactly. Oh, we're getting there. You know we're going to get to Vincent. We have to. Sadly, apparently Dickens wasn't the nicest guy and wasn't as loyal to his wife as he should have been. But his work is good. Yeah, Vincent, hello. Chronologically had to get to Vincent. Really quite beautifully done, I think. Obviously, we have a story in our family. We had a copy of Irises that hung in our kid's bedroom when he was little, and it was a guest room and then it was a kid's room. So we left the picture up there. And I never thought about it, and when he was about 5, we took him to the Getty Museum, which is where they have the actual irises. And I was pushing him in the stroller, maybe he was 4 at that point, and we walked in the room, and the first thing he did was he saw that and he went, mine! And I was like, well, not exactly, not that one, but yes, you knew what this was. And I thought, oh, how fun is that? And of course, when it came around to see this episode, by then he was already 15. It was quite fun to go, look, we have this connection to Vincent van Gogh. But we know all about him, the many, many, many paintings. A couple years ago, the museum was closed down and they let the exhibit travel the world, which was really kind of, yeah, wasn't that amazing? Amazing. I sometimes teach a class, an early freshman class, that has to do with sort of art in your life. And I show them the ending of this episode just to see the effect of all the people in the museum and all that. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful piece of work when you think about it. And this is the moment that I really love. So yes, have to. Again though, as a writer, had to deal with you can't solve this. You can't fix him. You can't make him happy. So all you can do is I had one moment where it had an effect on him. I saw him be happy once, right? That's enough. Yes, sir? Yes, exactly. That was a few trips ago. But I think they do a lovely job on that. Nikola Tesla didn't get a lot of love for a long time. Nobody was paying attention to him. And then, of course, the cars showed up, and suddenly people were like, who is he? Suddenly everyone wants to know his name. Really interesting stuff, I think. So again, in the Jodie era, bringing Nikola Tesla into the thing, if you go to the Griffith Observatory, which is, again, in Los Angeles, that's where we live, you can see this Tesla coil, which has been there forever. And it was people before we, again, had reappeared in popular culture, like, what is that? I never saw that. I don't understand what that is. You explain it to me. It's really cool. I like the Griffith thing very much. There's another really cool history show, if you've never checked it out. It's from Canada. It's called Murdoch Mysteries. He's a cop in Toronto at the turn of the 1900s and often runs into famous people. Often they're Canadians, which is super cool because we don't get a lot of Canadian history down here. But often they're Americans who were racing up into Canada to do one thing or another. And they did a Nikola Tesla episode, which I thought was quite fun. But just the idea that we didn't know a ton about this guy and that he could have been our Edison, right? But we swapped out whose idea was better. And you never know at that moment in history who was going to win. It's the beta VCR. Exactly, right? And now my joke is you can't even give a student a DVD because they don't fit in computers anymore. So we keep changing how we pass our information along. I remember years ago, there was a TV show called Planet of the Apes, based on the movies, right? And there was an episode once where they found a computer, but they didn't have anything to put in it. And it's like, and it was the fear of that's why books are so much better, because someone, if they can figure out the language, will be able to access them. But if we just have piles of, like someone's got their VCRs over in the vendor room, or the VHSs, excuse me, and you're like, my gosh, if you don't have a machine for that, it's useless. So all the knowledge in the world could disappear. All right, Agatha Christie, as I said, gotta have Agatha Christie. Again, they went that many years without getting Agatha Christie. I love this picture of all the books she did in her life, right? The character that we see when we see Agatha Christie. I like pictures of women doing their work, recognizing that we had these careers, that they've done these things, so that's a great shot. But we all think of her as a little old lady, because she got to live that long, which is a beautiful thing. But all these books, all these things we know, she was 26 when she published her first book. She was like, granted, a woman had money, so she had time to sit around and write, right? We understand there was privilege there. But the fact that she was 26 and invented Hercule Poirot, who's like this amazing literary character, right? And I also think people forget that she was a mom later in life, right? Such an interesting, full life that she led. She left her first crummy husband and then went on with a cute guy who was 10 years younger than her, and they stayed together forever. So really an amazing life that she lived, and pretty much wrote a book almost every year in all that time. Think about that literary output. I think that's amazing. Probably the best piece of history that I feel like I learned in watching Doctor Who was the story of Noor Inayat Khan. I had never heard of her. This is something I had said last year about why I liked Jodie's era so much. I was introduced to all these women who had never come into my history classes. I really, really did thank Chris Chibnall for that. I think he promised to do it, and he did that. And in this case, here's a story I never knew. So she was an Indian woman, a South Asian woman, who was a radio operator in World War II. And the first woman they put behind the lines in France to work with the resistance. She could speak French. She was able to do that. Several people who were sent with her were all killed. So she was alone trying to transmit the information about troop movements and all that sort of thing. Imagine lugging that stuff around with you to make this work, right? So she had to be excellent. We were making jokes about the technology earlier. That stuff was obviously much harder to operate, right? She managed all of that. She had a code name, Madeline, right? That was her fake character that she created to beat people. But she was eventually turned into the Gestapo, and she was sent to the Dachau concentration camp where she was executed. So this is an amazing, heroic woman. Never appeared in any of my history books. Nothing I had ever seen about World War II until I saw this. Yes?
I don't want to interrupt you.
No, please.
Thank you. I read an article one time that we may have lost touch with a lot of artists' work, women artists, because as they would get married, they would change their last name.
Yes.
And they wouldn't realize that it was the same artist.
Oh, that's very true. Oh, we do that a lot. A lot of writers happen that way. There's the first people who adapted Little Women into a movie long before Greta Gerwig, who I love, were Victor Mason and Sarah, oh my God, see, I'm forgetting her real last name because she's Sarah Mason in my head. They worked together. They got an Academy Award for doing the adaptation. The problem was when the Academy did oral interviews, they interviewed him because he ended up directing the Marx Brothers in a couple movies. So he has an hour-and-a-half tape at the Academy Guild about his career. She was alive the same time they did that. They never sat and talked to her. A year later, he died. He gets like this much obituary. 2 years later, she dies. She gets this much. Doesn't even mention her Academy Award because she's the wife of Victor Mason. That's it. They forget that she had this. And if you look her up on IMDb, she had like 20 films she wrote before they got together. Then they wrote a few together. Then he became a producer, and she wrote a bunch after him. So who was the real writer in that team? Yeah, there's also, see, this is my other lecture for students. There's a star on the Walk of Fame. It's to Mr. and Mrs. their name, and it's his name, Mr. and Mrs. Bob Jones or whatever. Who's she? You have no idea. If you look him up, he had 3 wives. Which wife is supposed to be referenced in that star? You have no idea. Yeah, so that's a big one. Also, women did not keep their archives, Women didn't make sure their papers went to colleges. If you think about the various people in Hollywood, we hear more about Cecil B. DeMille than Lois Weber, who was directing at the same time and did just as much. But she didn't give anybody papers. So there's no archive you can go look at, but you can look at all his stuff. Yeah, that's a big deal. Women have to remember to save their stuff and give it to someplace, a library or something like that. Yes, so the other thing is, I did not know this until I was doing this research. She was a children's book author before she got into the military, right? She came from a very rich family as well. And then after the war, because of her sacrifice, she got both the Croix de Guerre from France and the George Cross from England. This plaque, this bust of her and this plaque is in Bloomsbury, where she lived in England. It's the first South Asian and the first woman ever to be given a plaque in her honor in their city. Right? Amazing stuff. And this is a book about her, her exploits, if you will. All because she showed up in this one episode. And it wasn't even an episode all about her, right? She was just part of the whole bit. Yeah?
This kind of happened to me with the TV show, I think I remember, called Timeless.
Yes!
There was an excellent show for the time, and they actually met this guy, the real Lone Ranger, and I'm like, I had never heard of him. And I was like, so we were doing, his name is escaping me, I will get it eventually, but the real Lone Ranger. And I'm like, you're learning about him, and like, and then you look up, I was like, okay, he actually really existed. And then, so we're doing, I work in a library, we're doing African American History Month, and I mentioned the real Lone Ranger, and everybody's like, oh, I'm like, look it up.
Exactly. That's what writers love to do, is unearth the stuff that nobody else has talked about before, or to talk about it in a new way. Right? And I think that's what really, I mean, I had to get her book. I've got this book on hold now. It wasn't easy to get, but I want to read her children's stories. Why do I not know them as much as I know Grimm and Aesop's and all those stories? Why aren't those taught in school? You know, on the flip side, I'm a big Anita Luce fan, speaking of women, and all these English literature classes will teach you F. Scott Fitzgerald. Nobody's teaching you Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. But his book actually went out of print for a number of years. Hers never did. And it's from the same era with the same attitude. So why are we teaching his story and not the one she wrote? Right? So that's choices that are made in the educational world. Who's more important? That's a big deal too. All right. Another thing I never learned until I was watching Doctor Who, and this is one of my favorite episodes because it's from a grandmother's history. We often don't think about going to the history of our mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers. Their lives must have been boring, right? They were just married to people and did stuff. No! It's so wonderful to me. I mean, what they were doing here was brilliant. They're just doing Father's Day in this era, right? Let's go back to one of the characters in one of our companions' past. But in this case, we're learning about the Partition of India post the war, which I didn't know a bunch about, and just the whole idea that we're going to split it up by religion, that people will be happier in their own section. Is that true or not true? Well, it was the experiment they started that is still going on, right? And to think about having to leave your homeland and go somewhere else because it's supposed to be safer or better or more comfortable, right? And a choice that was made above you, right, in some higher level governmental place, and you just had to do it. So I think this episode covers that so beautifully because it's about real people, right? And then I was looking at these pictures. Imagine, this is just everyone get on, you're going to a train someplace, we'll get somewhere. You'll set up a farm and do a thing, and you don't know what it's going to look like. I mean, imagine if someone just said, y'all have to move, if you live in San Diego, you got to move to Cleveland. You haven't seen Cleveland. You might not know what to do if you got there, right? But you're going now, get your bags, leave. And everybody did. I mean, that was such an amazing period. But they did such a good job, which is what Who always does, of making it's just the emotional story of two people. How that one large world event affected two people is really what works for me. Of course, The Idiot's Lantern covers what historical period?
30s?
Yeah, because what's happening in it on the TV? Television happening. It's the first big reason people in England bought a TV was to watch the Coronation. Exactly. So the idea that they covered the Coronation in their own way, and that you can see, of course, TV has loved to cover that. And it has another connection for us to Doctor Who. Although we have to admit, in our family, we thought he was way too whiny as the prince. But oh well. But yes, they did a lovely job. And this is the actual picture of Prince Philip he had to take her hands and kneel in front of her and basically say, hello, you are my queen, which is an amazing kind of dramatic thought. Again, in the way marriage wasn't meant to work, the woman wasn't meant to be more important than the man. But in this case, sorry, dude, that's how our culture works, right? Exactly. I mean, I think they did a really good job with that. So yeah. And then for me, it was amazing to see a piece of American history done on Doctor Who, right? And how were they going to do it? And I have to tell you, they did it better than I've seen it taught in this country, which kills me. The thing here is that a lot of people never realize, because they got the myth that Rosa Parks was just tired that day and didn't want to do this anymore. She had trained to be an activist. She was waiting for her moment to do that. And she was offering to be the black woman who got arrested by white Southern cops and sent to jail overnight, which might mean you weren't ever going to go home again. And she was willing to do that. This isn't just some little old lady who was too tired to get up. And it's so annoying when they picture her that way, right? She was an activist, and she wasn't that old at the time. And she made the choice to do this, and she had to wait till that moment. A lot of kids don't know when they say, oh, African-American people had to sit in the back of the bus. Well, it was dependent on how many white people were on the bus. So you had a little sign that hung between the seats, right? And if there's a bunch more white people, then we just move that sign down 2 more seats, and you have to get up and move. And now we'll move it down. It could move to the very back. We might not have any seated places for the black people on the bus because we just filled it up, right? So she was sitting in the last row behind the sign, hoping for it to move. And it was one of those days where it was busy enough it moved, and then she refused to leave her seat so she could cause the problem. She could get herself arrested, but she was already planning to have that happen. The other thing people don't realize is, of course, they know it sparked the Montgomery Bus Boycott, but people don't know, what did that mean? How long did the Montgomery Bus Boycott go on? Does anybody know?
A year?
8 months?
A year. A flat year for people not to ride the bus. That is, to me, one of the most amazing things. So what did you do if you couldn't ride the bus to work and you worked 2 or 3 miles from your house as somebody's maid or gardener or anything like that? You either walked in the rain 2 or 3 miles to work and 2 or 3 miles home for a year, because that was the commitment you made, right? Or you biked. Again, in the rain, if you had a bike, if you had the money to buy a bike. There were black taxi cab companies, right, in Montgomery. So in the beginning, they were giving people taxi rides for super cheap. And then the city got mad, and they cracked down on them and said that was discrimination against white people because they couldn't get taxi rides as cheap. So they were going to lose their licenses as taxi companies, so they had to not do that. So then a bunch of people who owned cars, including Martin Luther King, because he was a preacher, so he had a car, they created a couple places in town where you would walk to, and then people who had jobs and cars would...
Uber.
Exactly, they were the original Ubers. It really was. It was carpooling, and you'd get a bunch of people in your car. No, this is the days before we had seatbelts, so if you're skinny, we can put 5 of you in the back seats. There's no problem. And then it would be, okay, I have to be at work at this time. I'm going to go backwards. You know, you got to go to work 2 hours early because I'm going to drop you off first and drive to this guy's place. And then at the end of the day, we're going to go backwards with everybody. Until what the cops did was they could keep stopping you if you had a bunch of people in your car. Not because there were too many people in the car, because that wasn't a rule. But your taillight's broken. Here's the ticket. And by the time they were done, Martin Luther King had like $600 worth of tickets in a month. And they knew he couldn't keep paying them, and eventually he wasn't allowed to drive one of those cars anymore. So you had to keep thinking your way through it. So all year, while they're doing this meeting with the people who were running the bus companies, and they didn't just want black people not to sit in the back. They also wanted them to hire black men as bus drivers, because that was a pretty good job, right? It had a good hourly fee, et cetera. So they had a list of things. And this is the moment we know in American history that Martin Luther King comes to fame, because he was a new preacher in town. He was the young guy, and the men who ran the bus company were tired of talking to the other men. So they refused to meet with them. So they had to talk the young kid into going to these meetings. And it just turned out that he was this amazing orator. And ta-da, this moment in history. He wasn't even meant to work in Montgomery. He was supposed to work in his father's church, which I think was in Georgia. But he wanted to prove he could stand on his own 2 feet and not just inherit dad's place. So he had chosen to move to Montgomery, and he'd only been there for 3 months when this happened, right? And the other thing people don't know about the bus boycott is how much women were part of it, right? Women, the night that she was arrested, had to go, remember ditto machines? they had to create ditto flyers that said, we're meeting at the church tonight because we have to discuss what to do. And then they had to get around town and put them on the windshields of anybody they knew who had a job with a car, because how else would you know? There's no Instagram. There's no texting, right? They had to do all this work, and they were the female teachers in town who had access to these machines and did that work. They did it for the whole year until finally they busted the bus company.
I think also there's like one story, if I recall correctly, I've seen it in the kids' books, but it was like somebody had to feed these people too. Like pie, I think it was Pie Woman. Don't remember. Pies from Nowhere, I think is the title. I could be wrong. So,
No, yeah, but
But like this woman, I didn't read the book, but it basically, as I understand it, a real woman said, "Okay, I'm gonna feed you guys." And gave pies to these people.
that's what exactly. Oh, think about the amazing amount of support that all these people had to come to put together just to break one company of one rule. And of course they finally did. After a year of not having anybody in their buses, they were like, okay, we're broke. And the bus company was located in Chicago, right, which was in the north. They didn't even want the rule. It was just, that's your local rule. But finally they said, screw it. We're going bankrupt. You're going to do what we say now, or you wouldn't even have a bus company. But it took a year. And my favorite story is that it started December 5th, and it almost ended at the end of the month, because people wanted to get on the buses to buy Christmas presents because they had to go downtown to the stores. And so the preachers had to give lectures, sermons, at their churches and basically say, this year for Christmas, we're going to go back to Jesus and we're just going to spend time with our family and nobody's buying anybody a present because that's not the meaning of Christmas. And they talked everybody into not shopping, which also made the stores very mad. And they put pressure on the bus company. So the fact that, they chose to cover this and they hired a woman of color who was a writer in England to write this story, I think it was quite a beautiful thing that the show moved into doing. And I think a lot of Americans learned more about it than they might have learned from their own high schools, which I think is really true. Modern day, haven't gone much further than that on Doctor Who yet, but that's what I have today. Oh, thank you.